April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy.
On April 2nd, President Donald Trump declared a sweeping package of tariffs that impact literally every corner of the globe and nearly every product imported into the country. Since then, the stock market has continued to drop, entering bear market territory. Economists estimate that the tariffs will cost American households an additional $5,000 per year. Trump called it Liberation Day. But what tariffs exactly did he announce? How did he determine them, and what products will be impacted? In this video, we'll summarize what happened, then deep dive into country-level tariffs to explain what it could mean for prices going forward. A tariff is a tax placed on imported goods, that is, goods coming into the U.S. Governments use them to make foreign products more expensive, encouraging consumers to buy domestic alternatives, assuming they exist. Tariffs can protect local industries, generate revenue, or act as leverage in global disputes. They can be placed on specific products coming into the country, all products coming from specific countries, or some combination of countries and products. Trump did both. First, he announced a blanket 25% tariff on all foreign automobiles. This means all foreign automobiles coming into the country will be hit with the tariff, regardless of what country they come from. Then he pulled out a chart that listed tariff rates by country. These are flat-rate tariffs that apply to all products from the country, regardless of what kind of product it is. While the chart he was holding up only lists some of America's largest trading partners, the full list includes 185 countries and territories, including some of the smallest countries in the world, and even one territory that has no people at all. Products or countries can also be exempted from tariffs. Trump did that too. The countries and territories that did not get a tariff are Canada and Mexico, who have already received previous tariffs. Cuba, Russia, Belarus, North Korea, and Somalia are left out of the list as well. The administration claims this is because existing sanctions prevent any trade from happening with these countries, so tariffs would be pointless. However, some analysts dispute this and suggest that Trump is trying to appease Russia by leaving them off of the list, because some countries with sanctions, like Venezuela and Iran, received a tariff. Other countries left off of the list for no explicit reason included Burkina Faso, Palau, Seychelles, and Vatican City. And while the list included the uninhabited penguin-filled islands of Heard and McDonald, the list also did not include Antarctica. So, what are the tariff rates? To start, the executive order imposes a universal 10% tariff on all imports from countries on the list. Certain countries were singled out for higher tariffs, going as high as 50%. So, how did they determine who got a higher rate? How did they calculate it? The executive order claims that the tariffs were calculated by determining what tariffs each country charges the U.S., including any currency manipulation and trade barriers. But that isn't what they did. Instead, they acknowledged that calculating thousands of tariff rates, country by country, product by product, would be nearly impossible. So they came up with a proxy. They used a formula that examines trade balances between two countries. Now, if you're confused by this equation, don't worry. Many economists were too when they saw it. It's not grounded in any major economic theory. But essentially, the implicit assumption is that if there is an imbalance in trade between two countries, meaning the U.S. has a trade deficit or even a trade surplus, then there must be some kind of tariffs at play. We'll keep this simple. They took the exports from the U.S. going into China, for example, and the imports coming from China into the U.S., determined the difference, and then divided it by the exports from the U.S. going into China, essentially the amount of goods China is buying from us. You can essentially ignore the other two numbers because the administration chose them, and the effect is to just multiply by 1. And that's it. They just looked at the exports and imports and calculated a percentage. This, they said, was what other countries are charging America. And so, in his words, to be nice, Trump is taking that so-called tariff on the U.S. and dividing it by 2, and applying it right back at the country. This is why the administration is calling the tariffs reciprocal, which is debatable because they're only based on the trade balance. But that's for someone else's video. We're here to understand the impact. So, before we dig into the countries, there are just a few more things to note. When do these tariffs take effect? The auto tariffs are already here. They went into effect right after Trump announced them. Automobiles are only subject to the 25% tariff, not the country-specific tariffs. The country-level tariffs from his charts are going into effect on Wednesday, April 9th. Will they start immediately? Yes and no. Technically, anything on ship that has already left a country before April 8th at midnight will not be affected. So, it only applies to foreign exports that are loading onto ships starting April 9th at 12:01 a.m. There is a long list of exemptions, but simply, the following are safe, meaning no tariff is applied. Steel and aluminum are not impacted by these tariffs. They're subject to the prior tariffs Trump announced. Copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber articles, certain critical minerals, e.g., uranium and lithium, and energy products are also exempt from all country-level tariffs. Now, for the rest of this video, we'll look at each country and the major products they export to the U.S. Those are the products most likely to be impacted by the new tariffs. Given the breadth of the tariffs and limited exemptions, nearly every product coming into the U.S. will be impacted. Because there are over 180 different countries and territories, we'll focus on the 60 countries that were hit with tariffs higher than the baseline 10% rate. These include some of America's largest trading partners, as well as some of the smallest, poorest countries in the world. We'll also look at some of the ones hit by the baseline tariff, mainly because of their role as a major trading partner in certain sectors. Let's start with China. The U.S. has announced new tariffs of 34% on all Chinese goods. That's a sharp escalation considering President Trump has already levied several tariffs on China. The trade relationship between China and the U.S. is hugely unbalanced. The U.S. ran a trade deficit of nearly $295 billion with China last year, the largest of any U.S. trading partner by far. A big reason for that is the range and volume of goods we import. From China, the U.S. brings in a massive amount of electronics, phones, computers, and TVs, along with machinery, furniture, toys, clothing, and countless consumer goods. Companies like Apple rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing, especially for product assembly. Major retailers like Walmart, Target, and Home Depot source large portions of their inventory from China, meaning these tariffs could push prices higher on everything from power tools to holiday decorations. Even Tesla, which produces cars in Shanghai for export, could feel ripple effects if China decides to respond. For everyday consumers, the impact might start small, but over time, prices on electronics, household items, and even apparel could creep upward. For companies, it means reevaluating supply chains that have been built around Chinese production for decades. Next up is the European Union. While not a single country, the EU functions as a unified trading bloc, made up of 27 nations with a common set of rules for trade, tariffs, and product standards. The U.S. is now imposing new tariffs of 20% on all EU imports. The trade deficit with the EU currently stands at around $235 billion. That's significant, second only to China. Top imports from the EU include automobiles, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery, wine, cheese, and luxury goods. German automakers like BMW and Mercedes, French cosmetics from companies like L'Oréal, and Italian fashion houses like Gucci and Prada all rely on steady U.S. access. American consumers may feel the impact in the price tags of imported cars, high-end fashion, and even specialty food and drink. For European companies, the new tariffs could cut into one of their largest export markets. The U.S. is imposing a blanket 46% tariff on all goods imported from Vietnam. This comes amid a growing trade imbalance. Last year, the U.S. ran a $123 billion deficit with Vietnam. Vietnam has become a major manufacturing hub, especially for companies looking to diversify away from China. Key imports include electronics, footwear, furniture, textiles, and machinery. A large share of clothing and shoes sold in the U.S. now originate from Vietnamese factories. Popular brands like Nike, Adidas, and The North Face rely on Vietnamese manufacturers. Furniture retailers like IKEA and electronics companies such as Samsung, which assemble some products in Vietnam, may also feel the impact. For American consumers, this could mean rising costs on everything from sneakers to smartphones. For Vietnam, it puts pressure on one of its fastest-growing export relationships. However, as of this video, Vietnam has announced they will drop all tariffs on U.S. goods. It remains to be seen if this tariff will remain in effect. Trump is applying a 32% tariff on all imports from Taiwan. The trade deficit between the two countries stands at around $74 billion. Taiwan plays a critical role in the global tech supply chain. The U.S. imports a high volume of semiconductors, electronics, computer parts, and machinery from Taiwan. It's one of the top sources for components that power everything from smartphones to data centers. A key player here is TSMC, the world's leading chip maker, whose products are essential to companies like Apple, Nvidia, and AMD. Other major electronics firms also rely on Taiwanese-made parts to build their devices. These tariffs could raise costs throughout the tech industry, especially for companies dependent on precision components. For consumers, it may lead to higher prices on electronics or longer wait times if supply chains slow down. The U.S. is applying a 24% tariff on all Japanese imports, well above the new 10% baseline that applies to most other countries. The U.S. runs a $68 billion trade deficit with Japan, and much of that is tied to cars, electronics, and heavy machinery. Japan is home to global brands like Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Canon, all of which rely on U.S. sales. Many of these companies already manufacture some products within the U.S., but those that don't could see their profit margins squeezed or their retail prices pushed higher. American buyers might notice price bumps on Japanese-made vehicles or electronics, and companies could face decisions about shifting more production to avoid the new tariff level. Last week, Nintendo announced they would delay accepting pre-orders for their new video game console, Switch 2, in response to Trump's tariff announcement. India is set to get a 26% tariff. The current U.S. trade deficit with India is around $45 billion. India exports a wide range of goods to the U.S., including pharmaceuticals, jewelry, textiles, chemicals, and machinery. It's one of the leading suppliers of generic medications to the U.S. healthcare system. Major Indian companies like Tata, Infosys, and Sun Pharma could be impacted, along with countless smaller firms tied to clothing, software services, and industrial components. While not as consumer-facing as some other countries, the effects may show up in areas like clothing prices, imported medicines, or even back-end costs for tech services that rely on Indian support infrastructure. The U.S. is imposing a 25% tariff on all imports from South Korea. The trade deficit with South Korea is around $66 billion, driven heavily by tech and auto exports. The U.S. imports a significant volume of semiconductors, automobiles, displays, appliances, and telecommunications equipment from South Korea. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and Kia are major players, with deep market penetration in the U.S. Hyundai and Kia in particular export large numbers of vehicles to American dealerships. While some production is based in the U.S., imported models will face higher costs under the new tariff, which could trickle down to consumers. Electronics and home appliances may also be affected, depending on how much is sourced from South Korean factories versus U.S.-based operations. The U.S. is applying a 36% tariff on all imports from Thailand, significantly higher than the base rate now applied to most other countries. The trade deficit with Thailand is just over $45 billion, with a steady flow of goods entering the U.S. across several key categories. Top imports include computers and parts, automotive components, rubber products, electronics, and prepared foods. Thailand is also a leading supplier of canned tuna, shrimp, and other seafood commonly stocked in American grocery stores. Companies in sectors like auto parts and electronics manufacturing, many of which quietly power American supply chains, may start to feel pressure. Brands like Western Digital and Seagate operate significant facilities in Thailand, which could mean higher costs on components critical to tech infrastructure. These tariffs may not immediately register with consumers, but the effect could build over time, particularly in industries dependent on intermediate goods and low-cost manufacturing. The U.S. is imposing a 31% tariff on all goods imported from Switzerland, more than triple the new 10% baseline. The trade deficit with Switzerland stands at around $38 billion, driven primarily by high-value goods. Switzerland's exports to the U.S. are dominated by pharmaceuticals, watches, medical instruments, and financial services-related equipment and software. It's also known for exporting luxury goods and specialty foods, though in smaller volumes. Major companies like Novartis and Roche could face added costs moving products into the U.S. market. In the consumer space, iconic Swiss watch brands like Rolex, Omega, and Tag Heuer may also see their U.S. sales environment shift, though their customers may be less price-sensitive. These tariffs are less likely to hit the average American shopping at the grocery store, but could ripple through healthcare, biotech, and high-end retail sectors. All imports from Indonesia will see a 32% tariff, more than 3 times the baseline 10% rate. The trade deficit with Indonesia is about $17.9 billion, and the flow of goods covers a mix of raw materials and finished products. Indonesia is a major supplier of rubber, footwear, textiles, palm oil, and electrical equipment. It's also one of the world's largest exporters of nickel, a key input in batteries and stainless steel manufacturing. Brands like Nike and Adidas source significant amounts of footwear and apparel from Indonesian factories. For industrial users, the cost of rubber and palm oil, used in everything from tires to packaged snacks, could also rise. These tariffs could affect both consumer goods and manufacturing supply chains, with cost impacts rippling across footwear, clothing, processed foods, and industrial production. Malaysian imported goods will see a 24% tariff. The trade deficit with Malaysia is about $24.8 billion, largely driven by high-tech components and electronics. Malaysia is a key player in the global supply chain for semiconductors, electrical and electronic products, solar panels, and machinery. It also exports significant amounts of rubber gloves, palm oil, and furniture. Major tech firms, including Intel and AMD, have operations in Malaysia that handle advanced chip packaging and testing. The country's role in the electronics ecosystem means even small disruptions can have outsized impacts. For American manufacturers, higher costs on components from Malaysia could add friction to industries like consumer electronics, automotive tech, and clean energy. The U.S. is imposing a 49% tariff on all goods imported from Cambodia, one of the highest tariff rates Trump has introduced by far, nearly 5 times the 10% baseline. The trade deficit with Cambodia stands at around $12.3 billion, largely tied to the apparel industry. Cambodia exports mostly textiles, footwear, and travel goods to the U.S. It's a major manufacturing hub for global clothing brands looking for low-cost production outside of China. Companies like H&M, Under Armour, and Gap often source apparel from Cambodian factories, and many private label brands sold at big box stores do the same. A tariff at this level could lead to noticeable price shifts in the fast fashion and budget apparel space, and may push some brands to shift production elsewhere to manage rising costs. As of this video, Cambodia's leader has reached out to Trump with an offer to drop their import tax on U.S. goods to 5%, well below what the Trump administration claims is Cambodia's so-called tariff, 97%. Unlike many other countries on the list, the U.S. actually runs a trade surplus with the U.K., about $11.9 billion, meaning the U.S. exports more to Britain than it imports. According to the formula put out by Trump administration, that would mean the UK shouldn't receive any tariff at all. However, based on the announced tariffs, all countries are receiving a baseline 10%, even if the U.S. is running a trade surplus. This effectively means that even if countries are buying more American products than Americans are buying from that country, they will still get slapped with a 10% tariff. Top UK exports to the US include pharmaceuticals, vehicles, machinery, spirits, and aerospace components. Iconic British products like Jaguar Land Rover vehicles and Scotch whiskey are some of the most visible consumer-facing imports. The tariff may have a muted effect compared to other countries, both because of the lower rate and the relatively balanced trade relationship. Still, companies operating in niche markets, especially in high-end automotive or alcohol, may see tighter margins or pass-through price increases. High-end brands may even consider forgoing the U.S. market altogether. In response to the tariffs, Jaguar announced they were pausing all shipments to the U.S. The U.S. is imposing a 30% tariff on all imports from South Africa, triple the baseline rate. The trade deficit with South Africa is just under $9 billion, with much of that tied to minerals, metals, automobiles, and agricultural products. South Africa is a major supplier of platinum, gold, and diamonds, as well as citrus fruits and wines. It also exports cars, particularly from manufacturing plants operated by companies like BMW and Mercedes-Benz. These tariffs could impact a mix of industrial inputs and luxury goods. Jewelry and auto prices could edge up slightly, and the wine aisle might see price adjustments for imported South African bottles. Like the other countries with a U.S. trade surplus, Brazil is set to be hit by the baseline 10% tariff. The U.S. runs a trade surplus of about $7.4 billion with Brazil. Brazil's exports to the U.S. include iron and steel, crude oil, aircraft, coffee, and meat products. It's a top global supplier of beef, soy, and ethanol, much of which finds its way into U.S. supply chains. Aerospace companies like Embraer, which sells jets to U.S. carriers and private buyers, could be affected, as well as commodity traders who rely on Brazilian agricultural exports. But at the 10% rate, the overall impact may be modest compared to countries facing much higher tariffs. Seeing one of the higher rates, imports from Bangladesh will be hit with a 37% tariff. The trade deficit stands at about $6.2 billion, with nearly all of it tied to the garment industry. Bangladesh is one of the world's largest exporters of apparel, especially low-cost t-shirts, trousers, sweaters, and underwear. Many major U.S. retailers, including Walmart, Target, and Old Navy, source their basic clothing lines from factories in Dhaka and Chittagong. A tariff at this level could squeeze both retailers and manufacturers, possibly leading to price increases on everyday clothing items or shifts in sourcing to other low-cost countries. For Bangladesh, it places a major pressure point on an industry that forms the backbone of its economy. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Singapore of about $2.8 billion. As such, Singapore will receive the baseline 10% tariff on all of its exports to the U.S. Singapore's exports include refined petroleum, electronics, medical instruments, and semiconductor equipment. It also serves as a key regional hub for multinational companies involved in finance, logistics, and tech. Given the lower tariff rate and the nature of trade, much of it is business to business, the immediate consumer impact is likely to be limited. Still, certain tech and industrial sectors may see costs shift depending on how companies restructure sourcing or logistics operations. The U.S. is imposing a 17% tariff on all goods imported from Israel, slightly above the baseline. The trade deficit with Israel is around $7.4 billion, with the bulk of imports concentrated in medical devices, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and diamonds. Israel is home to major players in tech and defense, as well as companies like Teva Pharmaceuticals, a leading supplier of generic drugs to the U.S. It's also one of the top exporters of polished diamonds used in American jewelry markets. Given the specialized nature of many of these imports, the effects of the tariff may not show up in everyday consumer prices, but they could be felt in sectors like healthcare, defense contracting, and high-end retail. The U.S. is applying a 17% tariff on all imports from the Philippines. The trade deficit is roughly $4.9 billion, and key imports include semiconductors, electronic components, coconut oil, apparel, and call center-related services, though the latter isn't directly affected by goods tariffs. Many U.S. tech companies rely on the Philippines for chip assembly and testing, making it a critical part of electronic supply chains. The country also supplies low-cost clothing and processed foods to American retailers. While the impact may be muted for consumers, businesses in electronics manufacturing and retail could see higher costs, especially for parts and finished goods that come through Philippine production lines. The U.S.-Chile trade relationship is relatively balanced, with the U.S. running a $1.7 billion trade surplus. As such, imports from Chile will receive the baseline 10% tariff rate. Chile is a major exporter of copper, fruit, wine, and seafood. It's one of the top global suppliers of lithium, a critical component in batteries used for electric vehicles and energy storage. These tariffs are unlikely to create noticeable shifts for consumers, but they could influence costs in sectors tied to battery production and clean energy infrastructure, especially as demand for lithium continues to rise. The U.S. actually runs a $17.9 billion trade surplus with Australia, one of its closest economic and strategic partners. It is the second highest trade surplus for the U.S. Despite this, the U.S. is applying a 10% tariff on all imports from Australia. Top imports from Australia include beef, wine, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, and coal. While the trade volume is substantial, the relatively balanced relationship and baseline tariff rate suggest minimal disruption for most consumers and businesses, though costs will still go up. Pakistan faces a 29% tariff on all imports into the U.S., nearly triple the baseline rate. The trade deficit with Pakistan is around $3 billion, with most imports tied to textiles, clothing, leather goods, and surgical instruments. Pakistan supplies a significant share of bed linens, towels, and undergarments sold in U.S. retail chains. It's also known for its export of precision surgical tools used in healthcare settings. The tariff may raise costs in the budget apparel sector and for certain medical supply vendors. The U.S. is imposing a 10% tariff on all imports from Turkey. The trade deficit is modest, about $1.5 billion, and Turkey exports a mix of machinery, automotive parts, textiles, and appliances. Turkey is a known supplier for white goods, like ovens and refrigerators, and has a growing presence in the furniture and clothing markets. At this rate, the overall market impact is expected to be limited unless tensions escalate further. Sri Lanka faces a 44% tariff on all U.S.-bound exports, over 4 times the baseline rate. The U.S. runs a $2.6 billion trade deficit with Sri Lanka, mostly due to apparel and textiles. The country specializes in intimate wear, sportswear, and cotton garments for major U.S. brands. Retailers like Victoria's Secret and Nike source specialty clothing items from Sri Lanka. The higher tariff could push some companies to explore alternate manufacturing hubs or raise prices in niche segments. The U.S. holds a $1.3 billion trade surplus with Colombia. As such, Colombia is subject to a 10% tariff on all goods imported to the U.S. Key imports include coffee, cut flowers, crude oil, and apparel. Colombia is one of the top exporters of roses and carnations to the U.S. flower market, especially around holidays. At the baseline rate, most of these trade flows are likely to continue uninterrupted, though profit margins could tighten slightly in lower-margin industries. The U.S. is imposing the baseline 10% tariff on all imports from Peru. The U.S. runs a $1.9 billion trade surplus with Peru. Imports from Peru include copper, agricultural products, apparel, and fish meal, used in animal feed and aquaculture. Peru is a key supplier of asparagus, blueberries, avocados, and grapes found in American grocery stores. At the baseline tariff rate, consumers are unlikely to see major price changes in fresh produce, but growers and importers may experience tighter margins during peak seasons. Nicaragua now faces an 18% tariff on all goods entering the U.S., nearly double the 10% baseline. The U.S. runs a $1.7 billion trade deficit with Nicaragua, largely due to its role as a low-cost manufacturing hub for apparel and textiles. Nicaragua produces basics like t-shirts, underwear, and athletic wear for well-known brands including Hanes, Fruit of the Loom, and private label lines sold at Walmart, Target, and Kohl's. These are the affordable, everyday items found in nearly every U.S. household. With the new tariff in place, brands may face tighter margins or opt to pass costs onto consumers, especially in value-focused segments like multi-packs and essentials. Norway will now see a 15% tariff on all exports to the U.S., a step above the base level but lower than more targeted countries. The U.S. runs a $2 billion trade deficit with Norway, driven by seafood, aluminum, and chemical inputs used in U.S. industry. Norwegian seafood giant Mowi, one of the largest salmon producers in the world, exports heavily to the U.S. for high-end grocery chains and specialty retailers. Hydro, a major aluminum supplier, also serves U.S. construction and packaging sectors. Shoppers may notice slightly higher prices on premium Atlantic salmon, while manufacturers could see cost increases on aluminum packaging or building materials. Jordan will be subject to a 20% tariff on all U.S.-bound goods. The U.S. runs a $1.3 billion trade deficit with Jordan. Dominated by clothing and textile exports, Jordan has long benefited from trade deals that encourage U.S. brands to source there. Companies like Dickies, Wrangler, and some VF Corp affiliates use Jordanian factories for durable workwear, uniforms, and basics. In niche cases, even Nike and Adidas source certain product lines from the region under qualified industrial zones. A 20% tariff may cause some companies to reroute production to lower-cost regions, but in the short term, costs could rise, especially on uniform contracts and private label athletic wear. New Zealand is also under the 10% tariff at the baseline rate. The U.S. has a $1.1 billion trade deficit with New Zealand, fueled by imports of meat, dairy, wine, and outdoor gear. New Zealand lamb and butter are premium grocery items, often found at retailers like Whole Foods. The country also exports large volumes of Sauvignon Blanc, particularly under brands like Kim Crawford, Cloudy Bay, and Oyster Bay. Recreational brands like Icebreaker and Kathmandu, known for wool-based clothing, also manufacture in or source from New Zealand. While a 10% tariff isn't likely to cause sticker shock, it may push some price-sensitive categories upward, especially in higher-end meat, dairy, and wine. Argentina also receives the 10% baseline tariff on its exports to the U.S. The U.S. runs a $2.1 billion trade surplus with Argentina. Key imports include beef, wine, soybeans, and lithium, the latter becoming increasingly strategic. Argentine wine is a popular mid-shelf staple in U.S. stores, with brands like Alamos, Trapiche, and Catena leading the Malbec category. The country's beef is prized in food service and restaurant supply chains, often positioned as a premium or specialty product. The tariff might slightly raise prices in niche food segments, but its real weight may be felt in the supply chains for clean energy and agriculture. Madagascar faces a steep 47% tariff, one of the highest tariffs to be imposed. The U.S. runs a $680 million trade deficit with Madagascar, mostly due to textiles, vanilla, and seafood. The island is the world's largest exporter of vanilla beans, used in everything from ice cream to fragrances. Apparel brands that prioritize ethical sourcing or sustainability, like Patagonia and certain fair trade labels, have sourced from Madagascar. It also plays a role in niche fashion and craft industries. The new tariff could affect the price of premium vanilla and disrupt specialty textile sourcing, though the impact on mass-market goods will be limited. Myanmar, or Burma, is now subject to a 44% tariff on all exports to the U.S., well above the base rate. The U.S. trade deficit with Myanmar is around $579 million, tied mostly to clothing, footwear, and precious stones. Brands like H&M, Inditex, Zara, and Primark have sourced clothing from Myanmar in the past, though political instability has prompted some companies to scale back. The high tariff rate reflects both trade pressure and geopolitical tensions. It could further accelerate the exodus of fashion brands from the country, further destabilizing the country. This would raise costs on only the remaining imports, like low-cost garments and basic footwear. Tunisia faces a 28% tariff, almost 3 times the 10% standard rate. The U.S. runs a $620 million trade deficit with Tunisia, importing mostly olive oil, electronics, wires and cables, and apparel. Tunisian olive oil is frequently sold under private labels in U.S. grocery chains, as well as in specialty markets. The country also assembles automotive wiring harnesses, which are used in global car manufacturing. The new tariff could nudge up prices on premium olive oils and raise input costs for auto manufacturers relying on North African wiring supply chains. Kazakhstan, a vast Central Asian country rich in natural resources, is now subject to a 27% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., nearly triple the 10% baseline. However, uranium and certain energy products are exempt from the tariff. The U.S. runs a $1.25 billion trade deficit with Kazakhstan, largely due to imports of oil, uranium, and industrial metals. The country is a major supplier of critical minerals like chromium and titanium, essential for aerospace, defense, and high-performance manufacturing. Though these materials don't show up on store shelves, they're embedded deep in U.S. industrial supply chains. The tariff could increase costs for defense contractors, engine manufacturers, and advanced manufacturers that rely on Kazakhstan's resource base, though exemptions for uranium and energy help soften the impact. Serbia is facing a 37% tariff, placing it among the higher tiers of targeted countries. Serbia isn't part of the EU, so its tariff is based on the country's imports and exports, not on the EU more broadly. This means it will face a much higher tariff than the 20% rate that EU countries will face. The U.S. has a $600 million trade deficit with Serbia, mostly from machinery, electrical components, rubber, and agricultural products like frozen berries and wine. While Serbia isn't a dominant trade partner, companies that rely on specialty rubber goods or niche tech components might feel the pinch. Serbian wines and frozen fruits, often used in food service and private label grocery brands, could also see slight price adjustments. Côte d'Ivoire is facing a 21% tariff on all exports to the U.S. The trade deficit is modest, around $418 million. But the country plays a vital role in the global supply of raw agricultural commodities. Most notably, Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest exporter of cocoa beans, supplying the base ingredient for much of the chocolate sold in the U.S. It also exports cashews, rubber, and tropical fruits. Major chocolate producers like Hershey, Mars, and Mondelez, which owns Cadbury, source a portion of their cocoa from Ivorian farms. Though the beans are typically processed elsewhere, tariffs on the raw product could eventually influence wholesale prices and put added pressure on confectioners already dealing with volatile commodity markets. For consumers, the impact would be subtle but persistent, possibly nudging chocolate prices up over time or shifting sourcing strategies to other West African countries. Laos is now subject to a 48% tariff on all exports to the U.S., one of the highest rates imposed under the new policy. The trade deficit stands at about $763 million, and nearly all of it comes from apparel, textiles, and footwear. Laos serves as a low-cost manufacturing location for contract apparel production, supplying U.S. retailers with basic garments often sold under private labels. It also participates in regional textile value chains tied to Vietnam and Thailand. While few U.S. consumers would recognize Laotian brands directly, the country contributes to the global supply of inexpensive clothing and accessories sold by companies like Walmart, Target, and fast fashion outlets. A tariff this steep could prompt brands to shift production elsewhere or raise prices on entry-level apparel. Botswana is now facing a 37% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., placing it in the upper tier of the new trade policy. The U.S. trade deficit with Botswana is relatively small, about $301 million, but the country is a major global exporter of diamonds. Botswana's economy is heavily reliant on its diamond sector, with exports often routed through global hubs and ultimately sold in U.S. markets by companies like Tiffany & Company, De Beers, and other luxury jewelers. Though the diamonds themselves are often cut and certified elsewhere, the tariff could raise costs in the early stages of the supply chain. For consumers, this might result in modest increases in high-end jewelry prices, particularly in pieces that rely on raw stones sourced directly from southern Africa. Algeria is now subject to a 30% tariff on all exports to the U.S., triple the 10% baseline. The U.S. runs a $1.4 billion trade deficit with Algeria, nearly all of it tied to energy products, particularly crude oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG. While Algeria doesn't export many consumer goods to the U.S., it remains an important energy supplier in global markets. The U.S. imports relatively small but strategic quantities of fossil fuels from Algeria to support refining and reserve diversification. This tariff is unlikely to affect day-to-day prices for U.S. consumers directly. Instead, most of the country's exports will fall under the energy exemption. Lesotho is now facing a 50% tariff on all exports to the U.S., the highest rate applied to any country so far. The U.S. trade deficit with Lesotho is modest, about $234 million, but the country plays an outsized role in one key area: apparel manufacturing. Lesotho is a major supplier of denim jeans, t-shirts, and workwear, often under contracts for American brands like Levi's, Wrangler, and various private labels sold in big box stores. Its apparel sector has been built around access to the U.S. market through preferential trade programs. This new tariff could deal a serious blow to Lesotho's garment industry. For U.S. consumers, the most direct impact would be on affordable denim and basics, particularly in the mid-tier and value segments. Retailers may accelerate their shift to alternative sourcing countries if costs become unsustainable. Despite facing wartime pressures, Ukraine will also face new tariffs. The baseline 10% tariff will go into effect on all Ukrainian goods. The U.S. runs a $497 million trade surplus with Ukraine, and the country's exports to the U.S. include iron and steel products, grain, honey, and industrial inputs. In recent years, Ukraine has become a valuable supplier of sunflower oil and wheat, as well as semi-finished steel used in manufacturing and construction. Given the ongoing war, Ukrainian exports to the U.S. have already been disrupted. The 10% tariff is unlikely to have a major practical impact right now, but it may add a layer of complexity for industries relying on Ukrainian metals and agricultural commodities if stability returns to the region. Mauritius is facing a 40% tariff on all exports to the U.S., making it one of the more heavily penalized countries under the new trade policy. The U.S. trade deficit with Mauritius is relatively small, around $187 million. But the country has built a niche role as a textile and apparel exporter, especially for high-end garments and tailored clothing. Mauritius has supplied suits, dress shirts, and luxury cotton garments to U.S. brands including Brooks Brothers, Perry Ellis, and Nordstrom's private labels. It has been viewed as a reliable source for higher quality apparel with an emphasis on craftsmanship. A 40% tariff will sharply raise costs for these importers, potentially prompting them to shift sourcing or raise prices on formal wear and upscale basics. While not as visible as mass-market clothing, these items could see noticeable price hikes at the mid to premium retail level. Fiji is now subject to a 32% tariff on all exports to the U.S., placing it significantly above the 10% baseline. The U.S. trade deficit with Fiji is modest, about $165 million, and centers primarily on bottled water, along with smaller volumes of apparel, fish, and handicrafts. The standout export is Fiji Water, a premium bottled water brand widely distributed across the U.S. in grocery stores, hotel chains, and gyms. The brand markets itself on purity and exotic sourcing and has become a recognizable name in the premium beverage space. This new tariff could directly impact the pricing and profitability of Fiji Water, possibly prompting retail price hikes or promotional cutbacks. The effect will be felt most in the premium beverage aisle where price elasticity is higher, but brand loyalty could still be tested. Liechtenstein is now subject to a 37% tariff on all exports to the U.S., significantly higher than the 10% baseline rate. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $243.7 million worth of goods from Liechtenstein, while exporting about $66 million to the principality, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $177.7 million. Liechtenstein's exports to the U.S. are diverse, encompassing sectors such as construction, automotive, dentistry, agriculture, audiovisual, and coating industries. Companies from Liechtenstein play key roles in these supply chains, providing specialized components and products. For instance, Liechtenstein is known for producing precision dental equipment and high-quality coatings used in various manufacturing processes. The increased tariff may lead to higher costs for U.S. businesses relying on these specialized imports, potentially affecting pricing and availability in sectors like dental care and construction. Guyana is now subject to a 38% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., one of the steeper rates under the new policy. The U.S. runs a $4 billion trade deficit with Guyana, driven heavily by crude oil, along with exports of gold, rice, fish, and timber. While some major commodities like oil and gold are reportedly exempt from the tariff, the rest of Guyana's export economy, especially agriculture and seafood, could take a hit. Guyanese shrimp and rice sold in ethnic groceries and food service supply chains may become more expensive or lose ground to other suppliers. For American consumers, the impact will be modest but noticeable in niche food categories, especially for buyers of imported rice and seafood. Bosnia and Herzegovina is now subject to a 35% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., significantly higher than the 10% baseline rate. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $179.1 million worth of goods from Bosnia and Herzegovina, while exporting about $53 million to the country, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $126.1 million. The primary exports from Bosnia and Herzegovina to the U.S. include leather products, apparel manufacturing products, furniture, and military equipment. The increased tariff is expected to have a substantial impact on the country's defense industry, which has been a significant contributor to its exports. For U.S. consumers, the impact may be seen in higher prices for imported furniture and specialty leather goods. Additionally, U.S. companies relying on Bosnian military equipment may face increased costs, potentially affecting procurement strategies and pricing. Nigeria is now subject to a 14% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., a slight increase above the 10% baseline. The U.S. runs a $1.5 billion trade deficit with Nigeria, driven primarily by imports of crude oil along with natural gas, cocoa, rubber, and leather products. Though the U.S. is no longer as heavily reliant on Nigerian oil as in past decades, energy imports still form the bulk of the trade relationship. Nigeria also contributes to raw material inputs for automotive parts and industrial goods, and it exports specialty agricultural items like organic cocoa beans. At this rate, the consumer impact will likely be minimal, but energy and commodity buyers might see small shifts in cost depending on how sourcing strategies adjust. Namibia is now subject to a 21% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., just over double the 10% baseline. The U.S. trade deficit with Namibia is relatively small, around $115 million, but the country exports a mix of raw materials, beef, fish, and diamonds to the U.S. market. Namibian beef and seafood often serve niche markets in the U.S., especially among importers focused on sustainable sourcing. The country is also a minor but consistent supplier of gem-quality diamonds, feeding into the global jewelry trade. For consumers, any effect would be felt in specialty grocery and luxury goods, with minor price changes more likely than major disruption. Brunei is now subject to a 24% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., more than double the 10% baseline. The U.S. trade deficit with Brunei is just over $111 million, with most imports centered on crude oil, refined petroleum, and petrochemical derivatives. Brunei's economy is heavily dependent on the energy sector, and while it plays a small role in U.S. fuel supply, its exports are important for certain industrial inputs and blended fuels. Because these products are largely used by refineries and manufacturers, the direct impact on U.S. consumers will be limited, but costs could trickle through in energy-intensive industries or long-haul shipping sectors. Venezuela is now subject to a 15% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., slightly above the 10% baseline. The U.S. runs a $1.76 billion trade deficit with Venezuela, with imports dominated by crude oil and refined petroleum products. While Venezuelan oil once played a larger role in U.S. energy supply, its share has diminished significantly due to sanctions and shifting trade patterns. Still, some heavy crude used in U.S. refining systems continues to come from Venezuela. The consumer impact is likely to be limited, but refiners and fuel distributors that depend on Venezuelan blends may face modest cost increases or consider alternate suppliers. North Macedonia, a small Balkan country with close ties to the EU, is now subject to a 33% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., more than triple the 10% baseline. The U.S. runs a $113 million trade deficit with North Macedonia. While the overall volume is modest, its key exports to the U.S. include buses, tobacco, and iron and steel products. One standout export is public transit buses, which are often purchased by U.S. municipalities and transport agencies. The country also supplies raw tobacco used in global cigarette production and rolled steel for industrial uses. This tariff could raise costs for government contracts involving transit fleets and nudge up prices in niche tobacco markets. While few consumer brands source directly from North Macedonia, downstream effects may ripple into transport and manufacturing budgets. Moldova, a small landlocked country in Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Romania, is now subject to a 31% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., over 3 times the baseline rate. The U.S. trade deficit with Moldova is relatively modest, around $82.9 million, but its exports focus on apparel, footwear, wine, and agricultural goods. Moldovan wines have carved out a presence in specialty wine shops and Eastern European grocery stores, often marketed as affordable alternatives to French or Italian varietals. The country also supplies textiles and garments, typically under contract for private label fashion brands or European wholesalers with U.S. distribution. For most American consumers, the impact will be minor, though buyers of Moldovan wine or imported Eastern European groceries may see small price increases. Retailers sourcing low-cost apparel from Moldova could also feel a cost squeeze. Angola, a resource-rich country on Africa's southwest coast, is now subject to a 32% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., more than triple the baseline rate. However, crude petroleum and other energy products are exempt from the tariff. The U.S. runs a $1.2 billion trade deficit with Angola, importing about $1.9 billion in goods in 2024, the vast majority of which is crude oil. Angola also exports diamonds, coffee, and seafood in smaller volumes. With energy shipments excluded, the tariff's impact will fall mainly on Angola's non-oil exports. For the U.S., that could mean modest price increases or sourcing shifts for specialty goods like Angolan diamonds and coffee, though the broader consumer impact will likely be limited. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, a vast Central African nation rich in natural resources but facing ongoing political instability, is now subject to an 11% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., close to the baseline rate. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $323.1 million worth of goods from the DRC, while exporting about $253.3 million to the country, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $69.8 million. The DRC's exports to the U.S. are primarily concentrated in the mining sector, with significant shipments of refined copper, cobalt, and diamonds. These minerals are crucial components in various industries. Cobalt is essential for manufacturing rechargeable batteries used in electric vehicles and consumer electronics. Copper is widely used in electrical wiring, construction, and industrial machinery. Diamonds are utilized in both jewelry and industrial applications, such as cutting and grinding tools. Cobalt and copper are exempt from the tariff, but industries reliant on other Congolese minerals may experience slight increases in production costs, potentially influencing pricing in sectors like electronics, automotive, and jewelry. Notably, the U.S. is actively seeking to strengthen its strategic interest in the DRC's mineral sector. Recent discussions have focused on potential investments and collaborations aimed at securing access to critical resources while promoting regional stability. Mozambique, a coastal nation in southeastern Africa, is now subject to a 17% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., a notable bump above the 10% baseline. The U.S. trade deficit with Mozambique is around $66 million, and its exports to the U.S. primarily include minerals, aluminum, and agricultural products. While Mozambique doesn't export well-known consumer brands, its raw materials support U.S. manufacturing and construction supply chains. The tariff may cause minor cost increases in those sectors, but the overall consumer impact will likely be limited. Zambia, a landlocked country in southern Africa with one of the world's largest copper reserves, is now subject to a 17% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., slightly above the baseline. Copper, however, is exempt from the tariff. Copper is Zambia's dominant export, but the tariff will instead affect smaller sectors like agriculture and semi-processed industrial goods. These include exports such as tobacco, sugar, and metal products used in construction or manufacturing. Given the narrow range of affected goods and the relatively low trade volume, the consumer impact in the U.S. is expected to be minimal. The exemption for copper helps shield the most critical area of trade between the two countries. Iraq, a major oil-producing nation in the Middle East, is now subject to a 39% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., putting it at one of the highest rates. The U.S. runs a $5.76 billion trade deficit with Iraq, almost entirely due to imports of crude oil and petroleum products. Though Iraqi oil makes up a smaller share of U.S. imports compared to years past, it still plays a role in certain refining operations. A tariff at this level could lead to sourcing adjustments by oil importers, but everyday consumer fuel prices are unlikely to move much as a direct result. Cameroon, a Central African nation with a diverse export base, is now subject to an 11% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., just above the 10% baseline. However, energy products like crude petroleum and lumber products such as sawn wood are exempt from the tariff. The U.S. runs a $55 million trade deficit with Cameroon, with key imports including crude oil, timber, and cocoa paste. With the largest export categories exempt, the tariff's effect will be limited to smaller sectors like agriculture and food processing. Imports of items such as cocoa derivatives used in specialty food products could see a slight increase in cost, but the overall impact on U.S. consumers is expected to be minimal. The Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic Ocean, are now subject to a 41% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., significantly higher than other countries. In 2024, the U.S. had a trade deficit of roughly $18 million. The primary exports from the Falkland Islands to the U.S. include non-fillet frozen fish, mollusks, and fish oil. The increased tariff is expected to have a substantial impact on the Falkland Islands fishing industry, which is a significant contributor to its economy. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to higher prices for imported seafood products originating from the Falkland Islands. Malawi, a landlocked country in southeastern Africa, is now subject to a 17% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., up from the previous 10% baseline. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $41.1 million worth of goods from Malawi, while exporting about $26.9 million to the country, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $14.1 million. Malawi's primary exports to the U.S. include tobacco, tea, and sugar. The increased tariff is expected to impact Malawi's agricultural sector, particularly affecting its tobacco and tea industries, which are significant contributors to its economy. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to higher prices for Malawian tobacco products and specialty teas. Afghanistan, a landlocked country in South-Central Asia, is now subject to a 10% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., aligning with the baseline rate. Though it's unclear why the Taliban-controlled country received the baseline rate, when the Trump administration claims the country's tariff on U.S. products sits at 49%. In 2024, U.S. imports from Afghanistan totaled approximately $22.6 million, marking a 13.2% increase from the previous year. Conversely, U.S. exports to Afghanistan were about $11.4 million, resulting in a $11.1 million trade deficit. Afghanistan's primary exports to the U.S. include hand-woven carpets, precious and semi-precious stones, and dried fruits. The imposition of this tariff is expected to have a moderate impact on Afghanistan's export sectors, particularly its traditional handicrafts and gemstone industries. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to slight price increases for Afghan products such as carpets and jewelry. Zimbabwe, a landlocked country in southern Africa, is now subject to an 18% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S. In 2024, U.S. imports from Zimbabwe totaled approximately $67.8 million, while exports to Zimbabwe were about $43.8 million, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $24 million. Zimbabwe's primary exports to the U.S. include ferroalloys, raw tobacco, and raw sugar. The increased tariff is expected to impact Zimbabwe's export sectors, particularly its mining and agricultural industries. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to higher prices for products such as specialty tobaccos and certain sweeteners originating from Zimbabwe. Syria, a Middle Eastern country that recently ended a years-long civil war, is now subject to a 41% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., significantly higher than the 10% baseline rate. In 2024, U.S. imports from Syria totaled approximately $11 million, while exports to Syria were about $2 million, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $9 million. Syria's primary exports to the U.S. include spice seeds, building stone, and antiques. The increased tariff is expected to have a limited impact on U.S. consumers due to the relatively low volume of trade between the two countries. However, importers of Syrian goods, particularly in niche markets such as specialty foods and antiques, may experience higher costs. Vanuatu, a Pacific island nation known for its rich cultural heritage and agricultural exports, is now subject to a 22% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., more than double the 10% baseline. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $13.7 million worth of goods from Vanuatu, while exporting about $7.6 million to the country, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $6.1 million. Vanuatu's primary exports to the U.S. include non-fillet frozen fish, perfume plants, and fish fillets. The increased tariff is expected to impact Vanuatu's export sectors, particularly its fishing and agricultural industries. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to higher prices for specialty products imported from Vanuatu. Pierre and Miquelon, a tiny French territorial collectivity off the coast of northeastern Canada, is now subject to a 50% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., the highest rate in the entire tariff list. The U.S. trade deficit with this remote archipelago is just $3.38 million, and trade volumes are minimal. Exports from Pierre and Miquelon to the U.S. likely consist of frozen seafood, processed fish, and a handful of artisan goods reflecting its maritime economy. Given its size and limited export footprint, the tariff will have little to no effect on the average U.S. consumer. But for local fishers and small producers in Pierre and Miquelon, it may present a meaningful trade barrier. Even though the territory is technically part of France, it's unclear why the collectivity is being hit with the highest tariff rate. Tied only with Lesotho, the tiny South African country also seeing the 50% tariff rate, Pierre and Miquelon only has a population of roughly 6,000 people and is made up of 8 small islands. Nauru, a tiny island nation in the Pacific Ocean, once prosperous from phosphate mining, is now subject to a 30% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., triple the 10% baseline. The trade deficit sits at roughly $1 million. Nauru's primary exports to the U.S. include low-voltage protection equipment, lifting machinery, and spark ignition engines. While these exports are modest, the increased tariff may impact Nauru's limited export sectors. However, due to the small scale of trade, the effect on U.S. consumers is expected to be negligible. Equatorial Guinea, a small oil-rich nation on the west coast of Central Africa, is now subject to a 13% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S. However, petroleum and other energy products are exempt from the tariff. In 2024, the U.S. imported roughly $127.6 million in goods from Equatorial Guinea, most of which were oil-related, with a trade deficit of about $32.3 million. With energy exports excluded, the tariff will have minimal practical effect on the country's U.S.-bound trade. Equatorial Guinea exports little beyond oil, so consumers and importers in the U.S. are unlikely to see any real impact. Libya, a North African nation with significant oil reserves, is now subject to a 31% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., substantially higher than the previous 10% baseline. The trade deficit sits at roughly $898 million. Libya's exports to the U.S. are predominantly crude petroleum and petroleum products, which constitute the majority of its export economy. However, despite the high tariff rate, the impact on Libya's oil exports to the U.S. is expected to be limited, as energy exports remain exempt from these tariffs. For U.S. consumers, this means that prices at the pump are unlikely to be directly affected by the increased tariffs on Libyan goods. Chad, a landlocked country in north-central Africa, is now subject to a 13% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., slightly above the 10% baseline. In 2024, the U.S. imported approximately $80.8 million worth of goods from Chad, while exporting about $59.9 million to the country, resulting in a trade deficit of roughly $20.9 million. Chad's primary exports to the U.S. include crude petroleum, insect resins, such as gum arabic, and raw cotton. The increased tariff is expected to have little impact on Chad's export sectors. For U.S. consumers, this may lead to slight price increases for products derived from the non-petroleum materials, though the overall effect is likely to be minimal due to the relatively small volume of trade between the two countries. Norfolk Island, a small Australian external territory located in the South Pacific Ocean, is now subject to a 29% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., significantly higher than the 10% rate applied to mainland Australia. Despite its modest population of approximately 2,000 residents, U.S. trade data indicates that in 2023, Norfolk Island exported around $655,000 worth of goods to the United States, with leather footwear accounting for approximately $413,000 of this total. However, local authorities, including Administrator George Plant, have contested these figures, stating there are no known exports from Norfolk Island to the U.S. Investigations suggest that this discrepancy may stem from misclassified shipments. For example, certain goods labeled as originating from Norfolk, intended to denote Norfolk, Virginia, or Norfolk in the United Kingdom, were erroneously attributed to Norfolk Island. Given the minimal actual trade between Norfolk Island and the U.S., the imposed tariff is unlikely to have a significant impact on U.S. consumers. However, the situation underscores the potential consequences of data misclassification in international trade policies. Heard Island and McDonald Islands, uninhabited sub-Antarctic territories of Australia, have been subjected to a 10% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S. This decision has raised eyebrows, given that these remote islands have no permanent population or significant economic activity. Despite their isolation, U.S. trade data curiously indicates imports from these territories. In 2022, the U.S. reportedly imported approximately $1.4 million worth of goods from Heard and McDonald Islands, predominantly categorized as machinery and electrical equipment. Investigations suggest these figures stem from misclassified shipments, where goods from other locations were erroneously recorded as originating from the islands. Given the absence of inhabitants and industrial activity, the imposed tariff is unlikely to have any tangible impact on U.S. consumers or the non-existent economy of Heard and McDonald Islands. This situation underscores the potential pitfalls of data inaccuracies influencing trade policies. Réunion, a French overseas department located in the Indian Ocean, is now subject to a 37% tariff on all goods exported to the U.S., making it one of the highest among all territories listed. The U.S. runs a $32.2 million trade deficit with Réunion. While overall trade is limited, the island exports include processed agricultural goods, specialty foods, and niche industrial components, likely routed through France or nearby ports. Due to its size and minimal direct trade, this tariff will have little visible effect on U.S. consumers. But for exporters in Réunion, especially those dealing in gourmet food products or island-manufactured goods, the elevated rate could present real barriers to reaching the American market. If you've made it this far, congratulations. That's not even half of the countries impacted. We've only covered a fraction of the tariffs Trump announced on Liberation Day, and people all around the world are still trying to figure out the implications they'll have. Thanks for sticking with us, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, we hate to ask, but please like and subscribe. Finally, if there's a country we didn't cover or you'd like us to dig deeper into, comment below and let us know what you'd like to see.